So thank you all so much. A summer in June, early church history. This is a good crowd, and thanks to those logging on. And we are recording, so the plan is to post this, and so it will be available for folks who are not here. And Truett, Evie, Eiley, Anna, thank you for being here. I offered Shireen, and Shireen said, yeah, Daddy can drop me off later with Grandma. So I've heard you talk, Mommy. It's all good. So this is the first of our three-part series that is aiming to dig a little deeper into some of the context of the world around, first today, the early church and the formation of the New Testament and some of the historical context surrounding when the New Testament was produced. And then next week, Julie Duff is going to be talking about the Reformation. And so what was the context of reading the Bible at the time when Protestantism was developing and forming? And then the final set of the series, the third session, will be Dustin talking about Methodism and that particular branch of Protestantism, and John Wesley and Charles Wesley and how that came to be, and the distinctive features of Methodism. And I think I know everybody here and in the Zoom room. There's Julie. We weren't sure if you were here or not. So I was just saying that you're going to be doing the Reformation next week. Yeah. And so I think I know everybody here, but I am Jackie J. I have been coming to Embrace since 2010. I started at the theater, and I am an Egyptologist by training. When Christina announced a few weeks ago and said, we have an Egyptologist in this church, not every church can say that, Shireen, my kid, poked me and said, is she talking about you? Because I think for Shireen, it would be normal to have more than one Egyptologist, but, and I became obsessed with Egypt when I was in grade 6. We did a unit in my social studies class, and that was it. And I went to, my undergraduate degree was University of Toronto, and it was ancient Near Eastern studies. So I started to study Hebrew at that point. I did 3 years of Hebrew and 1 year of Aramaic and Egyptian hieroglyphs, and then did my graduate degree in Egyptology at the University of Chicago, and then got a job at Eastern Kentucky University as the ancient historian in 2008. So I've been in Kentucky since then. And so many of the slides that I have pulled are from the upper division class I teach on Greece and Roman history. And so that is a full semester class. We do Greece the first half, we do Rome the second half. And so especially in the Roman section, as Christianity intersects with the Roman Empire, I talk a little bit about that in the class. And so this is a distilled version of the early Christian focused material that I talk about in my Greece and Rome class. And for those of you who were here for the Pete Enns book and series, he did a really excellent job of laying out the historical progression of the Old Testament and talking about from Exodus through particularly the Kings and Chronicles books, and that example we talked about with Manasseh of how Kings had one particular way of presenting it that spoke to the people at the time of the exile, and then Chronicles changed the story to speak to the people a few hundred years later. And so we're going to pick up a little before Christianity and Jesus with this map. And this is, you can see the green spreading significantly through the Middle East. We call it the ancient Near East. In ancient times, it's the Near East for whatever reason. And you can see the red lines traveling. And there's a key turning point in history. From the Egyptian perspective, the key date is 332 BC, when things change very significantly. Does anybody know what happens around 332 BC? Who's rising up and starting to take over the world at that point? Somebody kind of great, maybe. Dustin's giving you a hint. Pardon me? Yeah, Alexander the Great. So this is the expansion of Alexander the Great, and he came from Macedonia originally. His father Philip had moved south into classical Greece and had conquered the Greek city-states in the period, it's about 50 years at this point after Socrates. Aristotle was actually, the philosopher, was a teacher of Alexander the Great. So we're at the end of classical Greece, and now we see the rise of this empire building by a Macedonian king who had first taken over Greece and is now setting out to conquer the known world. And he took over Egypt from the Persians in 332 BC, and then just kept going east until he hit India, and his soldiers said, we're a little tired. I think we're ready to turn around. And he died at quite a young age in Babylon, so in Mesopotamia. And this expansion really sets the stage for what's going to happen over the next few hundred years, because this is what's called the Hellenistic period. And Hellene is what the Greeks called themselves. So this is the Greekification of the ancient Near East. And under the generals of Alexander the Great, after Alexander died at a young age, his empire was split amongst several of his generals. Ptolemy took over Egypt and became a pharaoh of Egypt and founded the line that ended with Cleopatra in 30 BC. Another general named Seleucus, or Seleucus, I think, Seleucids, he took over Syria, Judea, and so that territory that had been the core of the Israelite territory was under the control of General Seleucus and his descendants. So there you get the Seleucid dynasty. And as Peter Enns talked about, we see the Maccabees, and the story of Hanukkah happens under those Seleucid kings. And so that comes to impact the development of Judaism in the Hellenistic period, and then Christianity, because you have this layering of Greek and then Roman tradition on top of the existing tradition that had been there before. The kings of David and Solomon, and then we saw the Assyrians, we saw the Persians, and now we have the Greeks, now we have the Romans. There's a lot going on. And one thing that Peter Enns talked about in that really dense chapter near the end, that a lot of people were running out of steam. And so if you are able to go back and take a look at that, it was the chapter where the Jews were changing their thinking, and there was a lot of preparation leading toward Jesus and the Logos, because the Jews were interacting with Greek philosophy at that point, and Plato and the ideal forms and all of that was influencing how the Jews were thinking about their God, which then influenced how the Jewish Christians thought about what became the Christian God. And Alexandria, which is at this point the capital of Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great, because if you're going to found a city, you might as well name it after yourself. And that's in the delta of Egypt, right on the Mediterranean coast. It became an incredibly cosmopolitan and intellectually rich area. The Library of Alexandria had a host of intellectual, philosophical material from over the entire Mediterranean world and Near East at that point. And it seems from the research I did to prepare for this, I hadn't really thought about it, why were Jews in Alexandria at that point in the Hellenistic period under the Ptolemaic kings? And my first thought was, well, there's a lot of unrest in Judea itself, maybe they're fleeing. And that doesn't seem to be the case from the little research I did this past week. It seems more that this is such a rich and wealthy place to be that they're moving there to be part of that. And there is a very rich Jewish community, merchant community, that then we see a lot of intellectual activity bubbling up out of that. And this is the time when the Old Testament is translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. There's a tradition that says there were 70 men who worked on this Greek translation. And this is also the time when the apocryphal books that we talked about a lot in the Peter Enns series those were written. So First and Second Maccabees, the books that talk about the story of Hanukkah. There's a book called Judith. There's a book called Tobit. And those were all written in Greek. So they were composed in Greek. They weren't translations. They were written in Greek. And so a question that arose as we were talking about that was, why did these books get left out of the Protestant Bible when they're still in the Catholic Bible? And there's a foretaste here of Julie's class next week, because Martin Luther, when he was looking at these books, he said, we're big on tradition, sola scriptura, scripture alone, and these don't feel as authoritative because they're written in Greek. And so he put them in a little middle section in his translation of the Bible into German. And then with the King James Bible, they decided to leave it out altogether. And one theory that I heard was it would cost too much to print it if they had this extra stuff in there, and so they left it out. And so this is how our tradition develops. And so those are the apocryphal books. So this leads us then into the period when the Romans start to come into contact with these remains of the empire of Alexander the Great. And the Romans were starting to expand around 200 BC. This is the beginnings. This is the Carthaginian Wars with Hannibal in North Africa. And by 63 BC, there's a lot of activity of the Romans in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Roman expansion is motivated more by self-interest and wanting to protect themselves and their economic interests at home more than any grand world building plans. Alexander the Great really had this sense that I am going to go out and conquer the world. The Romans kind of slipped into it. They were very much on an offensive defense for the first part of their history. And once that snowball of empire building started to roll, they had to keep going with it, essentially. And so in 63 BC, there were a lot of pirates in the Eastern Mediterranean that were causing issues for the Roman economic interests. And Pompey the Great, at this point, we are at the time of Julius Caesar in his early career. Pompey the Great was Caesar's great rival. And at this point, they were still working together. They formed the first triumvirate. And Pompey the Great, in his early career, took armies into the Eastern Mediterranean and conquered Syria from the remains of the Seleucid Empire. So that was the end of that general dynasty of Alexander the Great. And so in 63 BC, Judea, that core around Jerusalem that remained very Jewish in its culture and mentality and religion, as it had been ruled by multiple other people, it became a Roman protectorate. And the Romans also didn't like to directly rule places that they had conquered if they could avoid it. It's a hassle to set up Roman governors in a territory if you can have a client king who's a native local that the locals will listen to, and he can collect tribute for you and give it to you, and you don't have to worry about direct control. That's what the Romans would much prefer. But the problem with that is that these client kings don't always do what the Romans want them to do. And so over the course of the period from 200 to 0 to the time of Jesus, we see a lot of transitions across the Mediterranean where the Romans say, you're a client king, you're too much trouble, we're going to put in a Roman governor instead. And then Roman governors would usually have tenures of anywhere from 5 to 10 years and direct Roman control. So after the conquest of Pompey the Great, they created a directly ruled province in Syria with a Roman governor. But they said, Judea is a little too far away. It's a bit of a backwater. We'll leave you under a client king. And so that's where Herod the Great comes into play under the reign of Augustus. And it was Augustus, Julius Caesar's great nephew and adopted heir, who had the fight with Antony and Cleopatra that ended in 30 BC with Egypt becoming part of the Roman Empire and a directly ruled province. That civil war between Augustus, Antony, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra ended with Cleopatra and Antony's death and Egypt becoming part of the Roman Empire. So under Augustus, Syria was ruled by a Roman governor, Egypt was ruled by a Roman governor, and Judea in the middle still had a client king. And that client king was Herod the Great of the New Testament, who's mentioned in the Gospels. How many people knew that the Herod the Great, the Herod at the time of Jesus's birth, is a different Herod from the time of Jesus's death? A few of you, but they all have the same name. It tends to get merged together, right? So at the death of Herod the Great, 4 BC, the Romans said, Herod has a couple of sons, also named Herod, just to make life difficult, Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas. We're going to give Archelaus control of Judea, and we'll give Antipas control of Galilee in the north, near the Sea of Galilee. And Archelaus was a bit more troublesome of a client king. And so in 6 AD, the Romans finally said, Judea is too much trouble. They just keep rebelling and causing us difficulty. We're going to make this a Roman province, and we will make this directly ruled. So that's why at the time of Jesus's death, we have Pontius Pilate, who is a Roman governor in place, directly ruling Judea. Herod Antipas managed to stay on the Romans' good side in Galilee. And so he stayed in control for quite a long time, 4 BC to 39 AD. And so he and Pilate are the two major forces in the region at the time of Jesus's death. So that's why you see Jesus being tossed back and forth between them in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover festival, when he was in the days leading up to his crucifixion. And it was under the Emperor Tiberius, who was Augustus's stepson and successor. Tiberius became emperor after Augustus, that Jesus was crucified. And the next couple of decades were really tumultuous for the Romans because they had some really terrible emperors, famous names like Caligula and Nero, very decadent, all about themselves, kind of not wanting to rule in a not really thinking about keeping the empire together or making decisions that are best for the Romans and the empire, more what's going to make me happy. But Augustus had set in place such a good system that even under these really decadent empires, it just kept chugging along and did really quite well. So we see Caligula a little bit after Jesus's death. In the 60s, when Paul was starting his missionary journeys, we have the Roman Emperor Nero. So that's the timeline there. And finally, in 70 AD, after the death of Nero, he committed suicide at the end of his very, very elaborate, decadent, pleasure-loving reign. You then see a fight over the throne, and a general named Vespasian became emperor and founded a new dynasty. And it was under Vespasian that the temple was destroyed. And we see the real shift for Christians. Then the temple becomes Jesus. For rabbinic Judaism, the temple, there's a shift to thinking about practice. This is what distinguishes us as Jews, the fact that we keep kosher, the fact that we're circumcised. And so there's a real shift after the temple is destroyed into how Jews and Christians are thinking about what it means to be someone practicing that religion. So that already is a heck of a lot. Any questions at this point? Clear as mud? Any questions from the Zoom room? All right. And so here's a map that lays out that division. The blue part is Judea. And you can see, oops, I won't mess with that. You can see Jerusalem right in the middle of the blue part. And so Herod the Great had ruled the blue and the purple in the north. And after the dissolution of that territory under Antipas and Archelaus, and then the Roman governor had the blue part to the south, and Herod Antipas continued to rule Galilee. And after him, that Galilee territory was also merged into direct Roman control. All right. So one thing that there's a book that I've been reading recently that is more, as a scholar, I see what books are being published and I create a list. And this is one that showed up that I was interested more for my own personal Christian interest rather than any research that I was doing. The book is called Papyri and the Social World of the New Testament, and it's intended for a public audience. It's written by a scholar. Sabine Hubner is a papyrologist who is in Switzerland, but she's writing this for a popular audience, and she's looking at, particularly from Egypt, because it's so dry, there's a huge desert full of papyri documents that are everyday documents from Roman Egypt that say, these are the contracts that craftsmen are making with the people who are employing them. This is how much literacy there is. This is how society works. And so she looked in this book at several case studies of what can the documentation from the time period tell us about what Jesus's life and the life of Jesus's family probably would have been like. And so some of the really interesting points she makes is that infant mortality is so high that for Jesus to have had as many brothers and sisters as are recorded, that's really unusual. His family would have been looked at as people particularly blessed by God because they have this large family. And as a craftsman, he was more middle class than of the poorest farming sector of society. And the fact that he was literate, middle class craftsmen were literate, and he was able to go into the synagogue and read from the scroll, that puts him in a middle status of society. So those are a number of interesting points that she makes. And as I was reading this about a month ago, there was a whole chapter about the census, because in the ancient world, census is critical from the perspective of the ruling class. You want to know how many people you have in each territory. You want to know how many people you have in each household. And what would be the rationale for that? Why would a ruling class really want to know the number of people? Taxes, exactly. So the Romans want to know exactly how many people they have in all of their territory so they can know how many taxes they can reasonably extract. And it's a very fine line, because you want to extract as much as you possibly can without causing rebellion and famine and everything else. So you gotta get the sweet spot, right? And so I hadn't realized before reading this book just what a debate there is over which census it was that is referred to at the time of the birth of Jesus, when Joseph and Mary had to leave Nazareth in the north in Galilee, where Joseph was working, and go back to Joseph's family's hometown in Bethlehem. And when we look at the extra biblical, so anything that's outside of the Old and New Testament, we call extra biblical sources. So if we look at an Assyrian contract and compare that to what's going on in the Old Testament, the Assyrian contract is an extra biblical source that helps illuminate what's happening in the Bible. And so when we look at the Roman histories, there were two censuses. There was a really big one that Augustus did impose over the entire empire in 6 AD. And we know that a fellow named Quirinius was governor of Syria at that point, and he is named in Luke. And so for a very long time, it's been assumed that this had to be the census at the time of Jesus's birth. But Herod the Great died in 4 BC, 10 years separate. So the math doesn't quite work. And Sabine Hubner looked at the title of governor, and she said, the word that we have traditionally translated governor isn't actually governor. It's a different title. The Greek word for governor would be strategos, and he's called a hegemon, like hegemony. And so we don't have to assume that this was 6 AD when he was governor of Syria. He was actually a slightly lesser type of official, a procurator, 10 years before in Syria. And we know there was a local census that happened under Herod the Great. And so she is arguing that we can make it all work if we say it's the local census that happened within the provinces of Galilee and Judea. And that is why Jesus's family at the time of his birth were traveling. And we think that Jesus was probably born right before Herod's death in 4 BC. So if the census was called in 6 BC, people had time to travel. They didn't have to get there immediately. You had a year or two to get there. And so it all works out beautifully. And after reading this, I thought, wow, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about this. I don't know how widespread this is going to become, but it worked perfectly for me, and it was kind of exciting. So I threw that in there. This is not something I've presented to classes. Does that make sense? Yeah, Mari.
Why were they traveling? Why did they have to travel somewhere else? Because I mean, we do census now locally, but folks, we don't travel if they're doing census on us. So why were they traveling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What is everybody else's understanding of that? Logan?
I've always heard that they possibly own property, or like this family members own property.
Yeah.
It was just land. Obviously, they didn't have a place to stay, so they didn't have like a house on it. So it's just like a piece of land.
And so it seems to be that you have to go back to the place where your family was from, so that if there's that connection that maybe Joseph still had property back in Bethlehem and they needed to have everything properly recorded, and you'd have to go back to where your family was from to make sure the Romans could have accurate records of all the property you had in that territory, as opposed to where you had moved to. So I suppose it would be like, if I'm a Canadian citizen who also has American citizenship, and so if I have property in Canada, Canada wants me to pay taxes on that, and I have to show to the American government that yes, I have this income, but I've paid taxes on it in Canada, so you can't tax me as well. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I wonder too if there was like a holdout among the Jewish people for a jubilee, essentially. So if you were not officially recorded with land that had been your ancestral lands, then you might miss out if and when that happened. So you have to make sure.
Yeah, so Dustin is pointing out that Jewish practice of jubilee and forgiveness of taxes every.
Well, like and returning the land that belonged to your family.
Yeah.
Over whatever, how many years.
Yeah, right, that it reverts. Yeah, if you've lost land, it's supposed to revert back to you, and any debts are forgiven.
Right.
Yeah, and the Romans are not really going to acknowledge the practice of jubilee, but you're holding out the hope. Yeah.
And if you're not recorded as like belonging to that land, then maybe you have less of a chance of getting it back someday.
Yeah, and this is supposed to be, if we follow this theory, it's a local census. It's not this broad empire-wide thing, and so they're wanting to know exactly what's happening on the ground in this territory.
It also kind of feels like it might be another opportunity for them just to exert control.
Yeah.
And, make you.
We can impose this
Right,
really
the-
arduous
the-
task on
yeah,
you that
have
we're,
to do
yeah,
this,
yeah. Yeah, no, and that kind of, because think about the practices of exile, that when the Assyrians and the Babylonians came in, they said, we want to show our dominance over you, and we don't want you to be where you originally came from, so we're going to transplant you to a place where you're not as familiar. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's probably from a economic standpoint, it's cheaper and safer for them to make everyone accountable to them to be counted,
Yeah,
as opposed to traveling around.
yeah, yeah. Yep. You're thinking like historians. This is awesome. All right. So then that's sort of how we can look at the context of what's going on at the birth of Jesus and the death of Jesus. Judea is under the control of the Roman government, and that plays a huge role, obviously, in Jesus's teachings and the different groups that he interacts with, the Zealots and the Pharisees, then having to interact with the Romans, the Zealots wanting to rebel against the Pharisees, or the Zealots wanting to rebel against the Romans, the Pharisees wanting to more work with them and not cause waves and trouble so that they can continue to have the temple and not have it destroyed. And so now if we jump forward a few decades, that same Greek, Roman, ancient Near Eastern, very hybrid context is also what informs Paul and his teachings, and particularly the letters that he sends to different places with particular directives as to, as new Christian communities, this is how you should behave and act. And so historians, when we look at this, particularly from the perspective of practicing religious people, we say, all right, it's a very, very important but difficult task to untangle what was Paul's teaching that is culturally bound to that moment and makes sense in that moment versus what should be universal for all Christians at all times. And you will have very different interpretations of that based on what the person reading the scripture at the time sees as the Holy Spirit leading them. And so that's some of the trickiness we talked about with Pete Enns, saying we're constantly reinterpreting. And the big question was, but how do we know we get it right? Right. And so I think it is the guiding of the Holy Spirit, and as a group thinking through this and being informed by what everybody else feels. And so it does feel like both a democratic process, but also a Holy Spirit driven process. I know Protestantism is very much the you and God, but especially as a lead team at Embrace, we kind of feel like we need that input from other people, right? And so one particular example that I use in my classes that is not so much a hot button one, although there are certainly still churches where women are expected to have their heads covered when you go in. There are Christian traditions that do that. But why is it that when Paul is writing specifically to a Greek church in the Greek city of Corinth, which was sort of like those Roman emperors who are very, very pleasure loving. Corinth had a certain reputation. That's where you go to party. And he writes to the Corinthians, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. So why should men have their head uncovered in worship and women have their heads covered? This is a statue of the Emperor Augustus serving in his role as the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest of Rome. And what has he done with his toga? He pulls his toga up over his head because that is what male priests do in pagan Roman tradition when they are worshiping and performing ritual. And so Paul is saying to the people of Corinth, the Christians of Corinth, who are both culturally Greek and now under the Roman Empire, being ruled by the Roman Empire, we want to distinguish ourselves from the pagan Roman priests, and men should have their heads uncovered when they worship. Women should have their heads covered. What kind of woman do you think would walk around town with her head uncovered in Corinth, typically? Women of a certain repute, right? And so Paul is saying we want to make sure that our Christian women are not viewed negatively by the surrounding culture. There's a certain degree of respectability here. And we tend to think of veiling as a Middle Eastern Islamic tradition. Greeks and Romans, elite Greek and Roman women were veiled when they left the house. That was a thing too, not necessarily the face veil, but they had their heads covered. And so here, Paul is very much speaking to a cultural context, and we can understand exactly why he's suggesting this to the Christians as a way of differentiating themselves from the local population. And whether or not you wear a hat in church is not as broad-ranging and difficult a topic as some of the other things Paul addresses that we talked about too in the Peter Enns book about slavery and the role of women. So slavery, there was a long arc, and there were many slave owners who used Paul to justify that practice in early America. And now we've moved past that. We haven't moved past the racial issues, but we, at least, I think, most conservative Christians would say, okay, we understand that was a cultural thing. Women, still an issue, right? And so this was mind-blowing for me. And this takes a little bit of unpacking, but in the Greek world, particularly classical Athens, there is an incredible, it's an incredible historical irony that classical Athens is where democracy rose, the radical democracy rose. And the only way you can have every citizen fully participating in a participatory direct government is to have only free, male, and local native citizens be able to participate in government. You always need somebody to do the work, right? And so the way the Athenian radical democracy worked was by disenfranchising the vast amount of the population who were not considered citizens participating in government to do the work. So those were the women, the slaves, and the foreigners in Athens. And elite women in Athens were very much restricted to the house. They weren't supposed to go outside. They were married young. It was all legitimacy of children. And so democratic Athens is one of the most patriarchal and repressive to women places in the entire ancient Near East, in the entire world, essentially. So it's that irony of democracy and extreme patriarchy coexisting and being symbiotic and needing to work that way. Rome wasn't quite as restrictive to women. Elite women were more educated, they had more freedom of movement. And leading up in the time before the Carthaginian Wars, so the wars in 215 was when Hannibal from Carthage in North Africa took his elephants around and came through the Alps and attacked Rome. So this is the time of the Carthaginian Wars and Rome's early expansion. And after Hannibal of Carthage was marauding up and down Rome and marauding up and down the peninsula of Italy and had some huge victories over the Roman forces. The Roman forces were decimated at a particular battle in 215 BC. The widows then got all of the property. So the widows of the men who had died in battle became very rich. And there were certain austerity laws put into place by the Roman senators saying, wives of Rome, for the war effort, we need you to stop riding in your carriages because this is wartime. We can't be ostentatious. You can't wear your fancy clothes. And we want to take all of that property and put it toward the war. And the wives said, okay, this is wartime. We will do that. Jump ahead 20 years, the war is over. And the wives say, wait a second, the war is over. Why aren't we allowed to wear our fancy clothes and ride in carriages? And why are you still taking our stuff? And so there was a big debate among Roman male politicians at that point. Should we repeal this law, which is called the Oppian Law? The Roman laws are named after the senators who proposed them. So this is the Oppian Law proposed by Oppius back at the time of the war. And the senators are saying, well, maybe we should repeal the law. And other senators are saying, no, we really need this law. And Cato was a Roman politician who was a traditionalist. And he said, now that we have this law, if we take it away, wives are going to go crazy. They're going to run right over us. And another guy, Valerius, says, no, we should repeal this law. This is not Roman tradition. We don't need this law to control our women. And I actually use this text in my upper division class, and we have a debate where students have to read the text, and some of them take the side of Cato, and some of them take the side of Valerius. And the question is, so Valerius says, we can repeal the law. We don't need it to control women. Is he a proto-feminist? And you keep reading, and he says things like, women don't need the law. They have their husbands to tell them what to do. That is our tradition, right? So patriarchal society. So neither one of them come out glowing. They just have different reasons. They're supporting the patriarchy in different ways. And Valerius says, we don't need the law. Family structure is good enough. So Cato, as part of his argument, says, indeed, I blushed when a short while ago, I walked through the midst of a band of women, because the women were so upset by this that they were going out in the street and accosting Roman politicians and saying, dude, you need to repeal the law. And Cato's like, what are these women doing? This is so over the top. So he's blushing, very Victorian. I walked through the midst of a band of women. I should have said, what kind of behavior is this? Running around in public, blocking streets and speaking to other women's husbands. Oh my God. Could you not have asked your own husbands the same thing at home? And so this is what Valerius would say. So Valerius counters and says, no, there is a tradition of women going into the streets and expressing their feelings. This is part of our tradition. Romans are very traditionalist, like Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. And so Valerius says this is part of our tradition. It's not unrespectable, but yes, they probably should have asked their husbands at home. He kind of agrees with that. And Cato is just completely shocked by this. So Beth Allison Barr is a professor at Baylor, very conservative school in Texas, as you know, and she did her degree in medieval studies and has come to the fore in the last few years because she was in the Southern Baptist Church and her husband was a youth leader. And she said, I am a professor of medieval studies teaching male and female students at the college level, and you will not let me teach high school boys a Sunday school class except with special dispensation. And so she wrote a book that is phenomenal called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And it's sort of like Jesus and John Wayne. They kind of go together, that how the conservative church has promoted patriarchy to support the status quo. As John says, we get political around here, and you can tell very much where my stance is. So in her book, she notes this really striking similarity that as a scholar, I read this and I was jealous that she noticed this when I hadn't, when I'd read the Opium law debates year after year with students. And I read her book a couple of weeks before we were doing this exercise of Valerian and Cato and students acting it out. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. So she notes that Paul says, as in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. So this is the way it should go. Roman tradition says, ask your husbands at home, and Paul is echoing those words. For it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. So it could be that Paul is very much building on the earlier Roman tradition here, but Beth Allison Barr, this is how she translates the next part. What? Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached? And so you can take that following part, depending on how you translate it, as Paul affirming what he has just said and saying, yeah, that's true. Or you can take it as kind of a sarcastic turn. Like, that's what the Romans do. That's not what we do. And so either way, it raises questions, right? And do we, just because Paul says women are silent, do we still have hats in church? Do we still have silent women in church? Or is he being sarcastic? These are the questions. And here is Beth Allison Barr's interpretation. Could it be that instead of telling women to be silent like the Roman world did, Paul was actually telling men that in the world of Jesus, women were allowed to speak? Could we have missed Paul's point? Bracket again. It's a fabulous book. So,
There's no punctuation in Greek.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you can't tell if he's like quoting Cato and then saying something.
exactly.
You just have to sort of understand the context.
Yeah, and so that's where that context is critical. And so if he is quoting Cato, what is he trying to say with that quote? And what is the core of this teaching? So it could be that he legitimately is arguing against women being silent in church as a Roman tradition that the Christians should not follow. And even if he is saying we need to conform to society, just because he's saying to that church we need to conform to society, does that mean that we in the 21st century need to continue to hold to that? So these are the kinds of questions that we ask when we come to Paul. Any thoughts, observations? Yeah, Mari.
They think that women shouldn't have no say so. First of all, I want to start back with the part where the veil thing. Okay, we gotta cover our hair for what? And why couldn't we talk? Like, why didn't we have any say so? Like, we came to worship just like you did. God is not like, hey, we can't let her worship, but we're gonna let you worship. Like,
Yeah. So as it happens, this is my focus of research, and I'm writing a book on the rise of patriarchy and where patriarchy came from in the first place. And if you go back to hunter-gatherer society before farming, it seems to be a much more egalitarian society, that men's roles and women's roles are very much valued, because everybody is contributing to the well-being of the small family group that's wandering around finding the food that they need to survive. Around 10,000 BC, we see the end of the Ice Age, and in what's called the Fertile Crescent, which goes from Egypt up through Turkey down into modern-day Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, they have grains and animals that are good for experimentation with domestication, and you start to see the earliest settling down of people from nomadic bands. They're domesticating plants and animals, they're creating farming villages, and with farming villages, you get property, and you get property that people want to own. And so this is the start of a stratified society, rulers and the ruled, and figuring out how do we, since we're living in closer confines, village, we have to figure out how to get along with each other. A ruling class emerges that is mutually beneficial. The ruling class keeps society running smoothly, but the ruling class also says we deserve more stuff than you do, and so you can give us stuff to make sure that we keep society running smoothly. And so then the question becomes, why do women become the subordinate class? So as we see the emergence of quote unquote civilized society, we don't use the word civilization as much anymore because it has this positive progress connotation. We use state level complex society that is a bit more neutral because there are advantages and disadvantages. And in state level society, you have a very small ruling class ruling most other men and all women. And so it's just a few elite men who come out at the top. And so why is it not women who become that elite group? And I think that really the one thing that differentiates men and women is the fact that women do have to carry and bear children. So women don't necessarily have to raise the kids. You can have somebody else do that, but women do have X amount of time when they are carrying and bearing kids. And with infant mortality in the ancient world, as farming societies emerge, women have to be pregnant a lot of the time. And so I think that's what gave men the edge, and some men then jumped forward to become the elite. And royal women then became symbolic of that royal power. And royal women are always subordinate to royal men, but part of that ruling elite. Does that make sense? Does that help to unpack some of that? Yeah. And so as I say to my students when I teach this, knowledge is power, and understanding how this system developed and the fact that it hasn't always been like this means that it's not a universal, right? That those who would argue patriarchy is the way it should be because it's always been that way, you can come back and say, well, but it hasn't. It's a system that developed over time, and we're now in a very different world, and things can change. Yeah.
Still like that over there, though? Like, do they still have that rule for women, wearing bills
And that's I think a lot of it is colonization, and as you move into a wealthier industrialized society, gender equality is more possible. And so it can be difficult because you look at a Muslim world and say that feels very repressive from our standpoint. And from my personal perspective, it is very repressive, but there are also reasons why they're a little further behind, quote unquote, than we are in terms of gender equality. Yeah. Yeah, Jennifer?
I was gonna say, except that they weren't. There was a period in through the 60s and 70s, even in that part of the
Yeah.
world,
Yeah.
where there was becoming more equality.
Yes.
But we're also starting to see that conservative resurgence in America.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I'm hearing voices say women shouldn't vote, and, all of these other things, which I never would have heard or never did hear 30 years ago.
Yeah. So my husband is from Iran, and up until the Iranian Revolution, women did not have to wear headscarves in Iran. And then at the time of the revolution in 79, a very repressive conservative regime came into play, and it's issues of control, right? And it's the same issues that it's fear of losing the power that you have. And so these are the same issues of racism and xenophobia and sexism. It's all the same causes. Yeah. And so exactly. And Afghanistan too, they were much further along on the road to gender equality in the 50s. And so, yeah, one might argue that the same thing is happening here too.
What is the purpose of the veil, though, for women to wear to hide something, to hide what she was.
Yeah, the idea is that a man wants to ensure that his kids are his kids. And so you then want to protect the purity of women in whatever way necessary. And so in Athens, they say, let's just keep elite women in the house. And therefore, they are not interacting with other men to have this issue. Other societies veil. There's different ways of, but it's all about protecting the patriarchal family and the descent, the lineage.
Sort of like evolution, because that's about making sure your bloodline.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. All right.
Tallness of man.
Yes, notice that we have a,
They want to be in control of the women because they're not the ones making the babies. And they feel like they should hold the power over the woman because they're the ones making the babies. But if you think about it, that you came from a woman. So what power do you really have? So yeah, I would understand that maybe Paul was saying, okay, women have the same right as you do. Because, you know, we walk around for 9 months and we're creating you
Mhm.
and every other mankind. You can't make one, so I feel like it's
Yeah.
it has something to do with you trying to control
Yeah.
the way and what women do with their bodies.
Yep.
And it continues.
And it continues. Yep. Yep. Once you have power, it's really hard to let that go. That is,
Competition, all you have to do is compete with half of humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yep. Yep. And if you're not the one who has to, you make sure that you have kids who are your bloodline, but then you don't have to worry about raising them. Your life is significantly easier. As egalitarian parents in this room would agree. So yeah, it's tricky stuff. Yeah, Dustin.
Jeremy's saying, can we just make sure we repeat what people are asking? 'Cause
Oh, yes. My apologies. Yeah, so Jeremy, the question was, why does gender inequality arise in the first place? And so that led to that history lesson and the fact that people are commenting that so much, so that we can look at the Middle East and say that feels very repressive, but they were more quote unquote progressive in the middle of the 20th century. And America, one might argue, is now falling backward. Does that help? Any other questions, comments? All right. So we have, we're actually making pretty good time. So we have, now we're going to jump forward to what the early church looked like. And up until 300 AD, this is the context where we see those early house churches and Christians not being accepted by the official Roman government because the Roman government didn't really care if you worshiped your own local gods, as long as you were also willing to worship the emperor who had become a god at that point. And for the Romans, and for really the whole ancient world, it's that transactional human divine relationship that you have to keep the gods happy so that they'll make your life easy. If you piss off the gods, they're going to bring storms and plague and famine and everything else. And so for the Romans, it's very dangerous to have portions of their ruled empire who say, yeah, that whole emperor worship thing, that doesn't jive with our exclusive one God belief, and so we're not going to do it. And so there certainly is conflict between the Roman authorities and both the Jews and the Christians because of that difference in belief. But we don't see the level of persecution and martyrdom 24/7 across the empire that we sometimes get a sense of from popular culture, the Christians being fed to the lions on a daily basis. There are blips. So there are long periods where there's fairly amicable live and let live, and then there would be blips of fairly intense persecution. And we see that Christianity has broad popular appeal, particularly among poorer classes and women, because it is a religion that says the last shall be first, right? And interestingly, the universalism of Jesus, that he is a God for everyone, that seems to be a really appealing idea as well. And at around the same time in the Roman Empire, we see the rise of the Egyptian goddess Isis as a universal messianic salvation deity too. So with empire, you see those local traditions and the boundaries breaking down, and there seems to be a need for a religion that everybody can get behind. And so Christianity then becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire around 300 AD. But before that, there are different competing religions that are feeding that same need of universality. And you can go from the Middle East all the way over to France, and every sort of feel like everybody's worshiping the same thing. So periodic punishment because of the refusal of emperor worship, but not constant. And this fourth bullet point, no recognized central authority in the church, although there was communication between bishops. The key cities, as a hierarchy emerges, you see in each city, the head of the church is a bishop. So there's a bishop of Antioch, there's a bishop of Jerusalem, there's a bishop of Alexandria. And as Protestants, or as a Protestant, I can say no recognized central authority at this point. The bishops are all communicating. What do you think a Catholic would say? Apostolic succession. From the very beginning, the Bishop of Rome was the most important one, right? And so you can look at it, and the Bishop of Rome, from my perspective, I look at the historical progression, and the Bishop of Rome does emerge as the most important. And we don't have a lot of documentation to prove it either way, but when I look at the sources, it feels much more decentralized than the teachings of the Catholic Church would say. And the book that I'm currently using in my Greece and Rome class for the Rome section was written by a man named Greg Wolfe. And he says, house churches were drawn together in each city under the leadership of one bishop. So you're starting to see the emergence of a hierarchy, and we go from acts and these very small groups to larger units of Christians working together, but usually trying to go under the radar of the Roman government. And in the earliest periods, we have a lot of evidence of women leaders in the church. We have women deacons. And so that seems to be, again, as this hierarchy develops, the early church conforms more and more to the patterns of the world and other patriarchal religious traditions. And a lot of that early countercultural element of the Jesus movement is slowly stripped away as the church becomes a social institution, like any other very powerful social institution. And there is an absolutely fabulous document that comes from 112 AD, so less than a century after Jesus's teachings. And we know with Paul in the 60s, we're spreading into Greece, we're spreading into Rome, the missionary movements are developing. But in the 100s, we don't have a lot of evidence of what the Christians were doing. So in Egypt, for example, we'll look at papyri and we'll say that looks like a Christian name. And that's what we're trying to trace based on hints of names. We don't have a lot of documentation, but this is cool documentation. And Pliny, let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. So Pliny was a Roman official, and he was placed as a Roman governor in a province in Turkey. So he's ruling this territory for the Roman emperor, who at that point was a man named Trajan. And he says, there's this group that's causing me problems, these Christians. And he writes the letter and he says, what do I do about these Christians? And so
This is like 10, 20 years after the last book of the New Testament.
yeah, he was not a Christian, no. So he's a pagan Roman worshiping the emperor, ruling this territory. And at this point, the majority of the territory wouldn't be Christian. Christians would be a minority. And he's writing back to the emperor saying, so I've got this minority group in this territory that I rule. They're kind of problematic. What do I do with them?
You're not.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got these Christians and they're brought before me as Christians. So lower level officials are seeing problems and bringing these people before me. And this is his strategy. I asked them, are you Christians or not? If they confessed they were Christians, I asked them again and a third time. So it's like, Dustin, are you a Christian? You say yes. I say, are you sure? Like, you sure you don't want to change your mind? And you say yes again and again and again. So is he really wanting to persecute the Christians? Does it sound like? It's more like he's giving Dustin every possible chance so that he doesn't want to cause trouble and be punishing people out of hand if simply for being Christians, if they'll just worship the emperor. Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, because Dustin, from Pliny's perspective, Dustin is he is a real threat. So if he doesn't worship the emperor, the political system is going to break apart, the empire is going to break apart, Roman authority is not being listened to, and the Roman gods are going to get mad and punish everybody. Just based, yeah. Yeah, it's that one little bad patch that we just need to deal with, right? And so if they persevered in their confession, I ordered them to be executed. For I did not doubt, let their confession be any sort, this positiveness and inflexible obstinacy deserve to be punished. There have been some of this mad sect whom I took notice of in particular as Roman citizens, that they might be sent to that city. So if you're a citizen of Rome, and we saw that with Paul as well, you get special treatment. And he says, oh, you're a citizen of Rome, I'm just gonna ship you off to Rome. I don't need to deal with you. They'll figure out what to do with you there. And after some time, as is usual, the crime spread itself and many more cases came before me. So we can't afford to let it slide because it's gonna spread. And so he goes on and on about how I talk to Christians. And then we get a really interesting hint at what Christian activity is like in this period. And this is the main of their fault or of their mistake. They were wont on a stated day, they meet together before it was light. So they get up at sunrise and they sing a hymn to Christ as to a God alternately, and to oblige themselves by a sacrament or oath not to do anything that was ill. They would commit no theft or pilfering or adultery. They wouldn't break their promises or deny what was deposited when it was required back again. And they would go and then they'd have a meal together. So they're singing, they're promising to do things that are pretty good for society in general, and they're eating together. These are the things that characterize Christ. Yeah, so threatening. And yes, so there's this edict, I published it. And these examinations of what's happening, I had to look into what's actually going on, inquire by torments what the truth was. And these are two servant maids who were called deaconesses. But still, I discovered no more than that they were addicted to a bad and to an extravagant superstition. So that's the charge here, that this is a superstition that is going to cause problems for the Roman Empire.
seemed like our God was.
They were the majority, right? So any minority is a threat. And so then at the end of the day, Trajan writes back to Pliny and says, you've done what you should. You've done what you ought in examining the causes of those that had been accused as Christians, for indeed no certain and general form of judging can be ordained in this case. These people are not to be sought for. Don't go out looking for them. But if they're accused and convicted, they are to be punished. But with this caution, he who denies himself to be a Christian and makes it plain that he is not so by supplicating to our gods, even though he was a Christian formally, may be allowed pardon. And so it's this smooth running of society. And if you're not going to conform to the pagan deities, this is a problem for the Romans. But what they're doing is not really all that bad, right? From a societal perspective. So it's a fascinating glimpse at the interworkings of very early Christianity and the Roman Empire. Yeah, Logan.
In this letter as well, that it's addressed that the Christians take care of the poor better than we do. There's another like ancient document, I just can't remember who, but it's between an emperor and another governor. And it's kind of highlighting the fact that I'm noticing they take care of people better than we do. What should I do?
Yeah.
And so
So Logan's observation is that there's Roman documentation where the Romans are observing that the Christians are better at taking care of the poor than the Romans themselves. And so there's this real tension. Yeah, exactly.
but yeah, I can remember that one.
Yeah, and I, to be honest, as I was preparing for this, I skimmed what I had highlighted, not the rest of it. So it may be in this, but I know that exists. Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
earlier we were talking, I missed a little bit, but you were talking about bishops and what would be the role of a bishop if you had a pastor? So some churches, they have a bishop who sits in whatever, and he says, most of the time they say that now. And then the pastor comes up and he does the preaching. But what is his role? Because he just sits back there in the chair while the preacher preaches and he just does nothing but announcements.
So the question is, what would a bishop do in the early church? And they're in the process of figuring out what it means to be a Christian and what their beliefs are. And so if you have a bishop of Alexandria, it would be like the Methodist superintendent of the Conference of Kentucky, that he's the one who's overseeing and making sure that everything that happens in each small congregation is the appropriate thing. So it's making sure that there's oversight as these small groups are developing. Mhm.
So is the pastor below the bishop?
Yeah.
The bishop is the higher ranking, and then there's the pastor.
Yeah, exactly.
Why in the world is he not preaching then? You know, I would think that it should be the other way around. The pastor does.
Well, because you don't, yeah, because you don't have mega churches. You have to stay under the radar. So why could, the question is, why could the bishop not be the one to do the preaching?
There's a bunch of pastors under one bishop.
Yeah.
In this scenario.
Yeah, so there's one guy who's kind of in charge of all the churches in a city, and he's making sure that they're all following Christian practice and belief. Yeah. Well, and because there are differences in different denominations. So certain denominations have no oversight whatsoever. Each individual church is its own thing, whereas other denominations do have this hierarchy of making sure that everything below structure happens. And so that's the churches that don't have the hierarchy would say that's much closer to what we see in the book of Acts, whereas the churches that do have the hierarchy say it's a lot bigger than the book of Acts. We need some kind of oversight. Yeah, and that's actually a really good segue to my last couple of points. because up until 300, Christianity is illegal. It's viewed as a problem for the Roman Empire, but it's growing and growing and growing. And so at a certain point, the Roman Empire really does have to figure out what to do with this. And we see a turning point with an emperor named Constantine. And Constantine's predecessor was an emperor named Diocletian. And Diocletian was the last of the really heavy duty persecution. So it was like there's the one last burst of persecution, and then we're going to completely shift and we're going to accept this religion. So there's a shift within 20 years that is very dramatic. And Diocletian had also tried to create a new system for governing Rome of co-emperorship, that the empire is too big, we're going to split it into east and west and 4 quadrants, and we'll have 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors, and that will be easier to control those particular regions, with himself being the preeminent of these 4 emperors. And Diocletian actually retired a few years before he died. He's like, okay, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to go off to my estate in Dalmatia, on the Dalmatian coast in Eastern Europe, and let you guys figure it out. And as soon as he was gone, civil war broke out amongst all of these warring emperors because they all wanted to be the one in power. So Constantine's dad was one of these co-emperors, and they were in England at the very far western edge of the empire when Diocletian retired. And so Constantine's dad first started to make moves to take over. And then after he died, Constantine stepped in and was trying to regain control over the entirety of the Roman Empire. And so he first became emperor in Britain in 306 AD, and slowly over the next few years moved to the center of the empire to take over Rome.
Can you just describe what you mean by
Well, he was a general, and so his soldiers were like, all right, you're going to be emperor. What are the details you're thinking of?
Like his closest bodyguard, like that part of his army, they were just like, we think you're the guy.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
That's how he became emperor.
That happened a lot of times, where the soldiers are like, there's a gap in power. We like you. We want you to fill the gap in power. And so he's acclaimed emperor by his soldiers, essentially. Yeah. And so then he moved into the core of the empire and defeated one of his rivals named Maxentius in Rome in 312, which is also said to be the date of his own personal conversion to Christianity, which is recorded much later by a Christian bishop. And so there's some question, how genuine was this conversion? Did this really happen early? Was it later? We're not entirely sure. But later tradition says that he was a very early in his life, he was a convert to Christianity.
Is it Constantine that was said to have had like priests or somebody following him so he could convert right before he died or something? I don't remember the whole story.
Yeah.
He,
Because the bishop's story is that in Britain, he's preparing for a battle and he sees a cross up in the sky. So that was early. And then that would suggest he was like on his deathbed. He's like, okay, I'm going to wait until my deathbed. And I'm not sure. So Jennifer remembers a story, and I feel like I've heard that too, but whether it's Constantine or not, where there's an emperor who doesn't want to convert until his deathbed. So he has priests following him around so that when he's about to die, that's when he's going to convert. Maybe that's it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it might.
Christianity changed very much after his.
Yeah, very much so. He was from the so at this point, emperors weren't necessarily from the city of Rome, but I honestly don't know where his family was from. But he had been posted to England, and that was the territory his family was ruling. His family was essentially a general of the armies at that point, and the soldiers acclaimed him as emperor. His guard said, we want you to be emperor. Yeah. And so where his family might have been from Eastern Europe. I'm not sure. That's a really good question. Diocletian's family was from Eastern Europe. And we had, previous to this, there had been emperors from North Africa. So there were emperors by 300 who would come from all over the Roman Empire. You didn't have to be from Rome to be there. Yeah. 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 But I don't think he was from England himself. Yeah. And so whether or not his early conversion is true, he certainly started to interact with the Christians and use them as a unifying force. And in 313, shortly after coming to power, he chose his own co-emperor, and he issued an edict that said Christianity is no longer going to be illegal. We are not going to persecute people for practicing Christianity. So he says, I, Constantine Augustus, as well as I, Licinius Augustus, that's his co-emperor, fortunately met near Milan and were considering everything that pertained to the public welfare and security. We thought, among other things which we saw would be for the good of many, regulations pertaining to the reverence of divinity ought certainly to be made first. So religion is important. Let's deal with this first. So that we might grant to the Christians and others full authority to observe that religion which each preferred, whence any divinity whatsoever in the seat of the heavens may be propitious and kindly disposed to us and all who are placed under our rule. So we're saying now religious tolerance, and hopefully then we're covering our bases and all the gods are going to love us, right? So it's not just religious tolerance for Christians, but for all religions, and we're not going to persecute the Christians anymore. And so why did Constantine promote toleration of the Christians? One explanation is that he had a genuine conversion and he was a Christian himself. Another explanation is that he saw it as politically useful. The Christians had become the majority by this point, and if he works with them, things stay much more stable. And so the problem at that point was there was so much disunity amongst the Christians about what Christians should believe that he says this potential unifying force is in itself incredibly problematic. So I need to get the Christians in a room so they can fight it out themselves and figure out what they actually believe. And then we can make use of this as a stabilizing force for society. And so he says, this is from another historian, Constantine learned that he could not rely on third-party arbitration to get Christians to stop fighting with each other. He couldn't delegate this. He needed to sit the two sides down with him and agree on a resolution of their differences. So this is the first gathering of the bishops that Constantine calls together. So it's a secular authority that gathers the bishops together at the Council of Nicaea to figure out what Christians actually believe. And the debates at this point were very much about the nature of Jesus, because the math doesn't work. Today, in most mainline Western churches, the accepted doctrine is that Jesus is 100% divine and 100% human, and that math doesn't make sense. Yeah, plus one. And so the very earliest split from the church, which was the Coptic Christians in Egypt and certain other Middle Eastern churches, said this makes no sense. He's 100% divine. We're going to go with that. And they're called monophysite churches because they say he took on the form of a human, but 100% divine, full stop. And then another heresy that had developed by this point was not so much about the divinity of Jesus, but as to his relationship with God the Father. And so this was the debate that the Nicene Conference was brought together to figure out. And so when you read the Nicene Creed that came out of this, you can see what they're speaking against. So we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made. One in being with the Father. So what we're saying here is that the bishops decided that Jesus has always been around. And again, it doesn't make sense, right? The Father should come before the Son. But no, Orthodox doctrine says they've always been there, coexistent for all of eternity, and Jesus is eternally begotten, and he is of the same substance as God the Father. So there's no difference in identity, light from light, God from God, and begotten, not made. A human begets another human that's just like itself. A human makes a table. So Jesus and God the Father are one in identity. So these are the issues that they're hashing out. And the idea that Jesus came after God the Father and was somehow different in substance, that is a heresy that became known as Arianism. And at this council, St. Nicholas was there and Arius was there. And there's a story that Arius gets so mad, he pops St. Nicholas in the nose. Oh, maybe it was the other way around.
Then St. Nicholas gets jailed because you can't do violence in front of the emperor.
That's right. Yes. So
That's
Santa Claus, it's Santa Claus who is popping Arius in the nose, and then he gets jailed for that. Yeah. And
Which,
so
by the way, today's Trinity Sunday, so-
there you go. So Trinity Sunday, we are talking about the nature of the Trinity. So with this, we see now a complete shift, and the Roman Empire is making use of Christianity instead of fighting against it. And then there's a shift and the pagans begin to be persecuted. So you flip it around. And here, this is a later icon where you can see the text of the creed on the scroll, and Constantine is in the middle. So he does look very secular. He looks like a king, but he's got his little staff with the cross. So he's becoming associated with Christianity. And then the bishops are surrounding him, and they've all got the halos. And so from this, we then develop later on into the notion of a Holy Roman Emperor in the 800s, 900s, Charlemagne, where the secular ruler is acclaimed by the Pope. And there's this unification of power, basically, that the religious authorities and the secular authorities are working together to promote control. And Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He just made it not illegal. It was about 100 years later that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that was about the same time as the permanent split between the Eastern Roman Empire that continued on in Constantinople, Byzantium, and then the Western Roman Empire that fell to the Goths in the 500s. And so this very much sets the stage for the emergence of a medieval Christian Europe that we think about, that's going to be in the West, a Catholic Europe under the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and then Eastern Orthodox in the East. And so I would imagine that Julie, as she's setting up the Reformation, is going to talk about the Catholic Europe tradition from which the Renaissance then emerges. Whew.
The medieval time area, it was forbidden for them to, I don't know what if it was East or West, but it was forbidden for them to even have a Bible, talk about Jesus. Like, people were running around hiding the Bibles and sneaking into somewhere else to go worship because it wasn't something that they were supposed to be doing.
And it was more, so the question is, in the medieval period, did people have access to Bibles? And the priest became really the intermediary, because the Bible was in Latin, and and Latin was falling away as a spoken language. So if you weren't educated in Latin, you couldn't really read the Bible. And so it wasn't so much that you weren't, I don't think it was ever illegal. It was illegal to translate it out of Latin. That was a problem. And so when Martin Luther, part of the Protestant Reformation was that the priesthood has too much power, and Martin Luther translated it into German so that people could have access to it on their own. Yeah. Yes, yes, people were, Tyndale. Yeah, people were burned at the stake for translating about 100 years before Martin Luther, right? That at the same time. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Any final questions, thoughts? Yeah, Chuck.
Just out of curiosity, like, I mean, shortly after the Nicene Creed and Constantine, is that when kind of formal Catholic mass and things that we think of as liturgy developed, or was that closer to the medieval times or somewhere in the middle? That's a weird question. I'm just curious, like, was that a slow, long arc of like more and more formal liturgy, or did Constantine, was there a quick move to more formalized liturgy at some point?
So Chuck's question is did Catholic liturgy come into being with Constantine, or was it slower? And my sense is that it would be slower later, that these traditions slowly developed. Yeah. And
I think that would have been more like the Bishop of Rome instituting that. And I don't think he was like the head guy quite yet.
yeah, so it was still more the because it's the independent bishops who were gathering together, and that was to develop, to hash this out. And so we don't get the sense at this point that it's the Bishop of Rome telling everybody else this is what you need to believe. It's more ecumenical, and they're hashing it out as a group. Yeah. And then certainly with the split, that's when the Pope starts to take on more and more of that traditional role that we think of as the Pope in the medieval period. And I think a lot of those liturgies would develop slowly in the 700s, 800s, 900s. Yeah.
I just got here, can you start all?
We recorded it, Dan. So I have no idea who and when it's going to be posted or where, but we recorded it. Yeah. All right. So 20 minutes until church starts. I'm as you can tell, I could talk about this for hours. And so if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate, but thank you. And Julie is next week. Yeah, Mari.
What happened to the Egyptian era though? Once, because I remember in the beginning you were showing that map. It looked like it circled around in Egypt a few times, and then elsewhere. But I know they believed Egyptians like that historical part, but they believed in other things that they had nothing to do with no God. They worship the sun, suns and stars and whatever else, but how did that come to end after the Greeks had come in?
Yeah. So Mari's question is Alexander, and yeah, so Alexander comes in and he circles around, and he actually went out into the desert and appeared before an ancient Egyptian oracle of the god Amun, and the god Amun said, "Alexander, you are my son. You are the one who is now the legitimate ruler of Egypt." So that's why he goes out into the desert, so that he can get acclaimed by the local Egyptian gods. And then he leaves Egypt and never comes back. And so it's his general Ptolemy who forms a Macedonian Greek dynasty in Egypt that ruled for almost 300 years. So it became a very hybrid society, worshiping both Greek gods and Egyptian gods. And Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, she took on the guise of the goddess Isis. She presented herself as Isis to the Egyptian people. So the Egyptian gods continued to be worshipped until the shift to Christianity in Egypt that was about 200, 300. And then it's fascinating. You see the ancient temples of the ancient gods being taken over as churches, and they'll scratch out the old gods and they'll carve crosses into the temple walls.
So they still have their religion even.
Mhm.
though Alexandria was there. They
Yeah.
still believe in their sons and the little.
Yeah. And so it's a very polytheistic religion. The pantheon has a lot of gods that have human bodies and animal faces, and so that continues up until about 400 AD. Yeah. Merged with Greek tradition. So then they develop these hybrid gods that are mixed mashups of Greek versions and Egyptian versions.
Well, it's crazy because I know a little bit about Nefertiti and what's his name?
Akhenaten.
Yes, he had his own religion where he went out and they made their own.
And that,
Was it Christian or
no.
was
So that's a blip. And that's about 1200 BC. So the question was about Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And early scholars, early Egyptologists, many of whom were Protestant Christians from America, read Akhenaten's hymn where Akhenaten says, "Sole God, I'm worshiping the sun. Sole God, there's no other." And they said, this sounds like Christian monotheism. It feels like a precursor. But they neglected the part at the beginning where Akhenaten said, "Oh, by the way, I'm also a god and my wife Nefertiti is also a goddess."
Yeah.
And so he's essentially narrowing the pantheon to the sun god, which is the disk of the sun, himself and his wife, to center that power on him. So again, it's a royal power play. Yeah. And it's not monotheism. Well, thank you. Yeah, if you want to cut her off, I'll try not to